Ladies and gentlemen, did Sony provide us a hint as to the release window for the PlayStation 6? Well, I think they did. As you probably know, just about every company, when it's being publicly traded, needs to give statements of how well the company is actually performing. So that includes, of course, profitability, losses, the sale of their products, what the longer term roadmap is, and so on. And to that end, Sony have made a couple of different statements. So, when the vice president of Sony, Naomi Matsuka, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, was talking to Bloomberg, they stated that the PS5 has had its sales forecast drop from 25 million down to 21 million, we'll get more into that in a second, and has also stated that the PlayStation 5 is entering the latter stage of its life cycle. Now note, the wording here is that it's entering its latter stage of its life cycle, and if you look, of course, to the release date of the original PlayStation 5, it makes sense, because at this point, of course, the console launched in November-ish of 2020, much like the Xbox Series consoles, so you can immediately just say, well, if you look at the previous generations of systems, this makes sense. By the end of this year, the console is going to be, out on the market for a good length of time. It will have been established. We know that the PlayStation 5 Pro is going to launch this year, from my understanding. I'll get more into that in a second. So I think a lot of rumors from myself, as well as some others at this point, that the PlayStation 6 is going to be launching in 2028 just make a lot of sense. Now, of course, there is definitely a possibility that a date could slip a little, but 2028 seems to be the target from Sony, which is going to be basically, roughly speaking, 2 years perhaps after the Xbox. Now, it's possible that Xbox might launch a little bit later. Microsoft at this stage, from what I understand, are going to launch in 2026, but there's a very outside possibility that some of the tech may not be ready for 2026 and it might have to slip to 2027, but at this stage I think 2026 for Microsoft is going to make a lot of sense, and 2028 for Sony. Now, there's a couple of things. Let's talk about the PlayStation 5 Pro real quick. So the PS5 Pro, I believe developers now have access to the development kits, which is obviously a really important step, because without the development kits, ultimately nothing will work. Especially the, well, I guess technically speaking, the, game will just run, but it would be essentially like it was just running on the original hardware. So developers now have access to the PS5 Pro. I don't know if every studio does, but the large AAA ones do. I think some of them got it last year in Q4. Some of them got it kind of early this year in like January, February-ish time. NDAs seem to have gone out. And I think, just from what I'm hearing through the grapevine, very likely that a late summer, possibly early autumn announcement from Sony. And this very much mirrors what we saw with the previous generation from Sony with PS4 to PS4 Pro. And also, of course, the rough life cycle of those machines. Sony are definitely a creature of habit. You can pretty much just say, well, they mirror the strategy, because generally speaking, it's pretty, let's just say it hasn't exactly failed them, has it? You can't look at like the PS4 and say, well, that just didn't work, let's not do that again. So I think for Sony's perspective, they feel that, the system's going to do quite well. Ultimately, the PS5 Pro, it's not going to push like as many units as the base model. Projections are all over the place. I don't think there's an official statement. I've heard it was like 15 to 25% from different people in terms of how many units it's sold versus the base model. Honestly, it's going to be very interesting to see how the PS5 Pro does, because obviously the cost is going to be a big factor. I don't think the PS5 Pro is going to be like super expensive, maybe a little more than the base model machine. However, a big problem that the industry has right now, and Sony have stated this actually in public as well, very difficult to cost reduce. Now, this is down to a lot of reasons. Inflation is obviously really not helping, and I don't need to tell you guys about that, but there are also a lot of other factors. So when it comes to the bill of material costs, obviously initially when a console is launched, typically they sell at a loss. How much of a loss does depend upon the console and the technology inside of it, but generally speaking, the system will sell at a loss, and of course software sales, as well as things like the controllers and other peripherals, as well as online services, will help that company claw back money. This is well established, and I'm sure you know that. However, What has been a pretty, what's been the law of the land is that with the PS4, the Xbox 360, so on, even if you go back to like bloody hell, like the NES and the Genesis and so on, you had these cost-reduced models, and this would work by, well, sometimes just essentially putting everything onto one chip, like for example the Xbox 360, making the chip on a smaller process, which of course reduces costs because you can get more stuff from the same wafer. And also the memory type also generally becomes cheaper, and so on. There's a lot of different reasons that the console becomes cheaper, but ultimately it does. However, this is not really happening with the PS5. TSMC are making a lot of profits at the moment. The PS5 base model is manufactured now on the 6nm process. It was originally using the N7 process, which is the same as the Xbox Series consoles. I'll be interested to see whether Microsoft have to actually shift and produce a 5 or 6nm version. Honestly, I don't know about that. I've heard they won't, but who knows what's going to happen in like a year's time. So for Sony, it's very difficult to actually reduce the cost of the system when for them the part cost is also very expensive. So it's going to be very intriguing to see what their strategy is going forward. Now, as for the PlayStation 6, I don't think it's going to be like, $1,000. I think they're probably going to have to make it more expensive than the base model PS5, because obviously, again, inflation is something that's just kicking us all in the nuts. But I think they're going to be cognizant of the fact that there is like an upper limit to how much money people are willing to pay, which is kind of interesting because folks will drop like $1,000 on a smartphone, but obviously they are also very different markets, and the number of sales for, like, let's say a smartphone and the model that a smartphone operates on, and also how many people it appeals to, is also quite different to, let's say, a PlayStation. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the PS6. I think the PS6 is going to be 2028, and I think that it's going to basically be a more powerful system than the next generation Xbox because, well, it's going to launch later. I've heard the graphics IP is probably going to be RDNA 6, maybe RDNA 7. However, as with anything, it's very difficult to pin down at this point because when you're talking about consoles, they generally have a lot of custom technology. So when you're talking about like custom technology, and you can also have a hybrid mix of GPU architectures, which is what Sony's done in the past, like the PS4 has like elements of Vega, despite the fact that the GPU is pretty much based upon Polaris. You can say the same thing with the original PS4. They beefed up the number of asynchronous compute units and compute queues, and they did some other bits and bobs as well, which wasn't in the, I can't remember the generation. Was it Bonaire? I can't remember. I don't remember the generation of GPU off the top of my head. But basically, they essentially kind of bolstered it, and of course AMD then incorporated that into their next generation stuff. So it's very difficult, but I think the PS6 is going to be very beastly. I suspect it's really going to push things like machine learning, upsampling, ray tracing, path tracing. I've discussed this in a recent video in much more detail. I also suspect, based upon the documents which are leaked from Insomniac, as well as some job postings, that we're also going to see improvements in physics and that type of stuff as well. It's going to be interesting to see what actually occurs there, because honestly, at this point, it would make a lot of sense to see exactly what Sony does with the PlayStation 6. I would also be very curious to see whether they'll do a Pro. I mean, logically, I think they probably will. I know the PS5 Pro started design before the original model actually started to ship, which makes sense, when you think about it. You give the teams a little bit of time off, and then you kind of say, well, back to work you go, fellas. But yeah, on a serious note, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the console market, I suspect, in terms of just, the direction these companies go. With that said, Sony is also now being spearheaded by someone completely different. So I don't claim to know what their strategy is going to be in terms of like 2, 3, 5 years time. I mean, honestly, it's very possible that a lot of stuff can change. There are some reports online that they're going to start bringing some games day one to the PC. And I don't mean the live service games like, like we have had already. I honestly don't know about that. I honestly don't know. Like, ultimately, I suppose it would kind of depend on, what title it is and what they felt in terms of profitability. I would be surprised if that happens anytime soon, because ultimately, I would make a very good argument that with the Xbox consoles, if Microsoft have actually left a little bit more of a gap between the PC and Xbox release, I think more people would have bought the Xbox versions of some games. But it's kind of like, as myself, I'll admit I'm primarily a PC gamer, but Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out at the end of this month, and I know it's coming to PC. Like, we know it's coming to bloody PC. But am I going to wait a year? No. I'm going to be a good consumer. I'm going to buy it twice. I'm going to buy the original on the PS5, and then I'm going to bloody well buy it again. And when it comes to, like, let's say some games on the Xbox, because I know that it's coming out on PC, I'm not going to buy the Xbox version. Now, I suppose you could make the argument that Microsoft get money anyway. However, a lot of the time, the only reason, to be honest, I own an Xbox is just to set it up in the living room, and just because it's smaller and that type of thing. But honestly, I wouldn't really miss the Series X. It's a great console. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But as mostly a PC gamer, I don't really miss the console that much. Like, if it's not set up, I can play all of those games on the PC. And I suspect for a lot of people, that's a really good reason just to not own an Xbox if you're a PC gamer. Because if you've got a reasonably mid-range PC, you've basically got a Series X. It's going to be interesting to see what Sony does on that front. Honestly, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. With that said, take care of yourselves, guys. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.